Hi everyone, welcome to the event. I'm Paul Patel, I'm an Associate Director at UPR. I run a democracy and politics team, and I'm very excited to listen to this conversation. You'll notice I'm not participating in the session, I'm here to listen. But nonetheless, I think I was asking you to say something, so I will. And I was just walking over with Chris, my colleague here just now, and he was like, what are you going to say? And I was like, I don't know actually. It's such an interesting time to be having a conversation like this, where the idea of liberty is being quite radically reimagined, sort of ambitiously reimagined, often dishonestly reimagined. And I guess one thing that feels true is the individualized, rights-based approach to freedom, negative liberties. That feels like it's fading. Freedom from interference has been replaced by a positive liberty, or I don't want to say collectivist, but certainly majoritarian freedom to do things. From a progressive perspective, in one world, in one universe, that could be a good thing. That could be a more democratic, a more republican way of making decisions and living together. But that's not the one we're seeing. Yeah, and that would be a different panel altogether. But the kind of version we're seeing is not this kind of radical republican positive liberty. We're seeing authoritarian and liberal populism in this country, in many countries like our country. And I guess that's essentially thinking about, or argues that the will of the people can override individual freedoms or democratic checks and balances. And I mean, a great problem with that is, in the will of the people, there are the people, and then there are others who are not the people. And that's where some of the fundamental tensions come from. And if that's the grand context of having this conversation, then what then of the freedom to express ourselves, and specifically the right to protest, the right to political dissent. And protest is political dissent. It's disagreeing with the prevailing ideas of the time, the ruling class, and the ruling ideas, the institutions as they are currently organized, the status quo, which everyone increasingly seems to want out of. And so the question is, well, how is the status quo responding to that? This is really an age of mass protest. You look at sort of what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years, there's sort of huge amounts of protests across the world, including in Britain, sort of really large amounts of people are protesting against the prevailing ideas. And what we've seen, mainly in response to these things, certainly in Britain in the past 4 or 5 years, is a frame of thinking about protest as a sort of legal act rather than a sort of a political act. The governments have essentially expanded the definition of criminality and sort of said, well, this protest is a criminal act now, and we're going to deal with it by saying it's illegal. And what that does is it sort of distracts us from seeing protest as a political act, sort of an expression of an idea that is not the mainstream idea, that requires a political response, a response based on ideas as a political act. I've seen very little of that. On the other hand, we've seen a shift towards liberal authoritarian policies. So I'm very excited to hear what Kiko and David have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this IPPR discussion on safeguarding democracy, civil liberties and the right to protest in the UK. I'm Zoe Grunewald, I'm a journalist and I'll be chairing this session. The right to protest lies at the very heart of our democracy, yet in recent years, political polarisation, new legislation and expanded policing powers have created tension between maintaining public order and protecting our fundamental freedoms. Today, we're joined by 2 experts who bring very different perspectives to discuss this tension. We've got the Right Honourable Sir David Davis, former Secretary of State for exiting the EU and a long-standing advocate for civil liberties. And we've got Kiko Hart, who is the Director of Liberty with deep expertise in rights-based campaigning and policy. We'll get some brief opening remarks from each speaker, and then I will guide a bit of a discussion with some key questions around the state of protest rights in our institutions and how we can rebuild some trust in our democratic system. But then, of course, I'm going to open it up to you guys because I'm sure you've got some really good questions. And then I'll invite some brief closing reflections from our panel. So, David, I'm going to hand over to you first for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a little bit of sort of all our yesterdays on it. I've been for a long time had the view that worldwide, globally, freedom is a minority pursuit. We're lucky in this country and in most of the democratic countries actually have our freedom. But that being said, even in Britain, there is always an authoritarian tendency in the state. Doesn't matter which party is in power, but particularly authoritarian tendency in the state. And we've seen it particularly over the last 25 years, a lot of challenges to freedom, mostly post the 9/11 episode, when the government had the counter-terrorism argument to pursue, and 9/11 of course accelerated by 7/7 here, 5 years later, 4 years later. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that happened before we get to talk about protests, because they're illustrative of how we protect freedom and how the assaults take place. So, Blair's government were, in particular, they did a number of things. 90 days detention without charge, they attempted to do. Control orders, that's house arrest after a secret court hearing. Another thing they tried to do, identity cards, deja vu, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Then 42 days detention without charge, and so on. You know, all of those things. That's at home. And abroad, again, something that's becoming relevant again. Torture and rendition were going on. Again, from a counter-terror point of view. All of these things really assaults on different freedoms. And the early days of the surveillance state and the database state, all of which will have some relevance. Now, the 90 days we actually defeated in Parliament. I led the rebellion, but there was the people who deserved the credit were some very brave Labour MPs, Nick Clegg at the time, leading the Liberals, and some others. And it was the first defeat of Blair, but it actually sort of put a line in the sand. Control orders, and this is where it becomes relevant today, control orders they weren't stopped, but they were massively diluted when the House of Lords, of all things, had a 30-hour session. They kept the House of Commons up 2 nights running. We were all accused of being unpatriotic and putting the British people at risk. Blair actually threatened to call an election, but the event eventually capitulated. This sort of thing is really sort of quite scary to some people. Identity cards, I fought the battle on that. I was a minority of one. In those days, 80% of the public were in favour of identity cards until the state lost 2 CDs with 26 million records on them. And then 70% of the public were against identity cards. I'd love to tell you it was my brilliant tactics, it wasn't. It was a circumstance. And 42 days, again it comes back to tactics. 42 days was the thing I had my by-election on. But the thing that really defeated it was the ex-head of MI5, Eliza Manning Buller, making her maiden speech to the Lords, and she stood up and said, "This is a wholly unnecessary bill." The head of MI5 said, "This counter-terrorism bill is wholly unnecessary." And it was defeated, I think, by record numbers. Majorities are something like 300. And Brown backed down, ran away from it. That's the sort of long history that's been going on since 9/11. But the authoritarian momentum, the authoritarian impetus is still there. And we come to it now, of course, in terms of the protests. One other thing I'd say, it wasn't just Blair, Liberty, with Tom Watson and I, brought a case against the Coalition of Cameron government, one or the other, on Data Retention Investigatory Powers Act, which we defeated them on. Ironically, the ECHR, what fun, given today's arguments about that. So all of that, and we're still getting it, jury trials today, digital ID cards. I thought I was going to lose digital ID cards until they were announced by our popular Prime Minister, his Midas touch. So that's of course what happened there. Now, we'll come to protest. Let me start by saying, and this might divide us, I don't know, that there are real issues here. I mean, there are real issues in the sense that, I'm a long-standing believer of the right to protest. My earliest political memory is an Aldermaster March for CND, my grandfather, when I was about that big. democracy, there is an absolute right to protest, a right to make it clear that you object to whatever the government is doing typically, or you object to something, or you have a strong view on something. And that's a right to be seen and to be heard. I don't take the view that it's an absolute right to inconvenience everybody. I'm not a great fan of doing yourself to trains, or stopping, although my grandfather changed himself the road was number 10, but I don't think that stopped anybody. So there is an issue there. There is an issue there. And that, of course, however, has been the excuse for a number of acts of parliament. The full title PCSC, the Policing, Crime, and Courts Act, Sentencing and Courts Act, the Public Order Act, and another act that's coming down the road with this government. I mean, the last two were the previous Conservative government. And there are all sorts of problems in them. I guess the first of them is that they give enormous unfettered power to the police. And those unfettered powers have already been misused. The simplest and most stupid example was the coronation, where there was a Republican group who actually got agreement from the police on what they were going to do, and then they ended up being locked up for about 12 hours. They were released, they weren't charged, because I think they were carrying straps of some sort, which is specifically prohibited in part of legislation. So that sort of first off is the first problem. The second problem is the sentencing. I mean, the sentencing is unbelievable in the sense, violent. I mean, I always take the view that violent crimes, murder, rape, other violent crimes, should be at the top of the sentencing tree. But some of the sentences have 10 years or so sentences for what I would view as, in some cases, technical offences. Also, there is a degree. There was always I'm not even sure it's not the case in international law, but the always presumption was the role of the state was to facilitate demonstrations, make sure that they could happen without enormous disruption to society. And it seems to have flipped on its head, so that the role of the state has now become suppressing demonstrations it doesn't like. And in this, the language becomes important too. We now talk about extremist views. Well, I have to tell you, I just don't believe extremist views should make it into the conversation at all. Because one person's extremist is another person's progressive. So, people may think I'm an extremist, like Europe, for example, or something like that. And we are in a habit these days with, how do I put it, echo chamber societies of viewing everybody else as, in some sense, extreme, in some sense, untenable. The left call the right fascist, and there's no doubt some horrible comment the other way. So you've got the vagueness, you've got that, you've also got a resurrection of suspicion-free stop and search. So this has been used, and again I come back to where I started, the authoritarian instincts of the state. The state always wants to control. It's not a bad instinct necessarily, it's not an evil instinct, it is just the outcomes are terrible. It wants to control, and so it gives itself all these powers without thinking through properly how they will work out to reality. And that, in my view, is where we are today. It's going to get worse with the new act, with the new bill of the current government. And frankly, it's up to those of us who are in this space to start to make plain that what they're fiddling with is absolutely a fundamental foundation block of our democracy. I'll stop.
Thank you, David. Thanks so much. So I think you're going to find that we are in violent agreements about that. So let's see how we go. Okay. So my best bet is that in the next few years, one of the critical pieces of political discourse is going to be freedom. The freedom to police our own borders, the freedom to ignore activist foreign judges, the freedom to say what we want. And that freedom, I think, is very different to the freedom you invited me to speak about today.
Because what is happening is that there are two competing twin track kind of versions, conceptualizations of freedom that are happening. One is essentially left-coded, and that's why IPPR has kind of organised this event about protest, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, left-coded, okay? And then there's a right-coded version. And the right-coded version of this conceptualization of freedom is also the one that has political and popular traction at the moment for all sorts of reasons. And the danger that we are facing in these spaces when we are talking about freedom, the freedom to protest in this way, is that we are not engaging with a wider conversation or with a competing narrative around freedom. And essentially the winds have changed on this. It is not possible to make a coherent argument around the freedom to protest without actually engaging with freedom of expression more broadly. As unpleasant as that will feel to so many in progressive spaces, it is impossible. And I'll give you a really, really kind of like tangible example of that, is that the current independent review on protest that is being led by Lord MacDonald is not just on freedom, is not just on protest and reviewing protest legislation, it's also on hate crime and hate speech. And those two things are now absolutely linked in the public discourse, and we would be wise to listen to that. So I'm going to give you an example of why this is so difficult to talk about in progressive spaces. And so this is an area where Liberty actually hasn't taken a view yet. We're kind of working on it at pace. We'll come to kind of like a position, but I'm going to kind of almost show my workings on this and kind of walk you through why this is so difficult. So I'm going to pick something controversial because everything in this space is controversial. I could not pick a freedom of expression example that doesn't kind of like, you know, make everyone feel slightly anxious in the room. So I'm going to pick the chants at Palestine Solidarity marches. So there's 3 of them that are getting a lot of heat, 2 in particular. One of them is From the River to the Sea. The other 2 are Death to the IDF, and the other one is Globalize the Intifada. So one position on this could be that the chants are legitimate political expression. They are freedom of expression that we should absolutely, you know, be kind of like be safeguarding. Okay, fine. But then you've got representatives from minoritized groups saying, hang on, at least 1 or 2 of those chants, they, in our view, are inciting hatred. Okay? They're inciting violence. We are feeling intimidated by them. Okay, so what's your response? Your response might be, not everyone in that community believes that, which is true, but there's also quite an interesting response to it. You know, and you could kind of pass that in many ways, but obviously no one community is a monolith. There are always multiple views within any community. Or you might say, actually, I disagree with you about the substance of this. You're saying that it means this, I'm saying that it means that. I don't think that's a particularly compelling argument, but that's one that's kind of being had. Or you could say, and I think this is potentially a more powerful argument, you could say, you need to look at the context. Think about speech, it's always about context. Look at the context, these are peace marches, these chants, this speech is being kind of like spoken, shared in the context of calling for speech, and therefore, you know, the chants are kind of part of that, and therefore they should not be criminalized. And that's fine, that's a legitimate position. And so essentially your position around that would be, you know, freedom of expression, political speech is incredibly precious. There's a community over here that is being intimidated by this speech, that, you know, and this speech is essentially hugely offensive to them. And on balance, we're going to be all right with that because the speech bit is more powerful. And that is fine to take that position. But then you need to stress test it. And you need to stress test it at a kind of higher order principle against speech that you might disagree with, against chants at other marches that you might disagree with. And that piece of work is what's not happening at the moment. And the converse of that is that you could land in an equally plausible and kind of totally conceptually fine position where you say, actually, yes, freedom of expression is really important. This group of people, are saying they are harmed by it, that communities are harmed by it, that it's incitement to violence. We are going to listen to them and we're going to curtail kind of like our speech in response to that. And again, you stress test that and you look at it, across kind of like multiple examples. And neither of those things are happening at the moment, because what is happening, and I think we all know this is happening, is that freedom of speech offenders are defending speech that they agree with, and it is an incredibly difficult space to kind of like pull away from that and actually kind of like make a higher order argument around freedom of expression. If we don't do that, then the fundamentals, of freedom of expression are actually at risk here. And so is our right to protest, which, as David said, is kind of foundational to our democracy. So this is the invitation that anyone who wants to defend freedom, the freedom to protest, is that we must engage with broader questions around freedom of expression.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I've got a few questions, but I just wanted to ask you briefly on that, Anita. I'm curious to know, in your view, and David, you come in this here as well, why you think potentially the right has sort of monopolised the conversation around freedom of expression. Do you think in progressive spaces there's still a willingness to deal with those difficult arguments, or do you think there's something else going on here about the way discourse has shifted on this towards the right?
I'd love to hear what David says, because I think there's probably like different diagnoses. These are really, really difficult, uncomfortable conversations, and I think in spaces which prize solidarity, above other values, they're going to feel really, really difficult. So I think that there is something about that discomfort.
Well, my view on that is basically the sweep of events, as is ever the case here. I mean, what's dominating British political society or British political discourse is now illegal immigration. And a great deal of the blame for that is being laid at the door of ECHR and so on. So, this is why I'm having to fight my own party over it. But, but the simple truth is that the flow of events will dictate these things. That being said, I'm not entirely sure it's entirely right, because I'm not inside the echo chambers of the left. And within inside the echo chambers of the left, there will be a different dominant narrative. What we're seeing at the moment is the echo chamber of the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and the Sun. But anyway, normally with these things, it's the sweep of events that drive it. As when I was telling my history tale about the early Blair years, the sweep of events there was counter-terrorism. And Mr. Blair was doing this because he thought it was a popular line to take. That's what politicians do a lot of the time. And the current government will be doing the same thing. They'll be going to the right because that's where they think the votes are. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. David, the big tension that you were getting at, I think, was this question of how disruptive must protests be to remain effective, but how much disruption can a democratic state legitimately suppress before the protest becomes kind of more symbolic than meaningful. I'm curious to dig into where you think that line should be drawn, where we get that balance between protecting the right to protest and preventing extremism that could threaten public safety.
Yeah, well, two things. Before I go down that, don't let me forget. But the first thing is that in democratic states, the laws that uphold freedom have to maintain a degree of popular acceptance. That's the first thing. If you lose that, you lose the argument, and the other side takes the freedoms away from you. And so when you're talking about demonstrations, certainly big demonstrations, are inevitably inconvenient to people. That is the case. That's just the truth of the matter. I work in Parliament. Whenever I come down to Sunday or Saturday and there's a demo, it takes me 2 hours to get there. So there is that inconvenience, and there's a certain amount of noise that goes with it. But the tipping point in this is where you stop worrying about having your point of view being seen on television or wherever, and you say, right, now I'm going to deliberately inconvenience people to draw attention to myself. I don't think that's a right. I I don't think there's a right to talk. And so that's why I started out when I was talking about the two acts under the last government. The aim was to deal with things that the public hated, right? But they did it in a really incompetent way, you know, and they just handed off to the police the right. No arrangement of judicial oversight, no arrangement of proper informing of the police's duties in all of this to give clear and reliable advice to the demonstrators. And so, you know, that's where the dividing line hangs for me. And I can't go by without picking up your case, because, you know, the old argument is, you know, hard cases make bad law. Well, there's no easy cases here, so it's quite hard to get good law out of this. But, you know, I take offence at From the River to the Sea, you know. I take offence to death to the other, and I think it's offence beyond the point of, you know, I'm always telling my colleagues, you've got to extend freedom of speech to the other side. Everybody extends freedom of speech to their own side. The only test is if you extend the other side. But there is a limitation on intimidation. There is obviously a limitation on race hate and anti-Semitism. There is a limitation on incitement to violence. And it seems to be those things, you know, if they don't cross those lines, they certainly skirt them. And that's where the problem is. You know, could the Palestinian generic movement have a demonstration without this? Of course it could. Of course it could. You know, so you know, that's my test.
Can I ask you a quick question? It's not about this. The farmers' protest at work in Westminster were really noisy. But they really noisy.
They're all noisy.
I thought it was the noisiest. Why don't you think that kind of drew the ire of, you know, press and parliamentarians in quite the same way?
Well, I think partly because I mean this is not, in a sense, it's not a fair test of your principle, right? because the farmers are more popular, as it were, their cause was more popular, and therefore people tend to be more antagonistic to the other argument. But yeah, well, as I said before, all of these demos are inconvenient. I would the line I would draw. Do you remember way back when it was early Blair? There was a lorry drivers' protest, and they deliberately blocked the motorways. The line. I wouldn't have allowed that, right? But that's where it crosses that line.
French protest. That's why French protest.
It was a very French guy. Never take a model of the French. Not in civil liberties terms. Maybe in fashion, but not in civil liberties. So yeah, that was a protest which was designed to inconvenience. You know, and that seems to me you can have protests without designing inconvenience.
So it's sort of like that balance of rights, right? You have the right to protest, but if it is impinging on the freedoms of people to
do the normal
go to work, go to hospital.
In some cases, I mean, I think with one of them, it was actually for ambulances to get to work.
Yes.
And that sort of thing.
That
Really loses the public. That really loses the public.
Okay, what are your thoughts?
And I think we agree that the line is wrong. So, you know, I think we all agree, and it's, you know, it's a point of law really, that these are not absolute rights. You know, they're qualified, you know, and you've got to balance, you know, that's one of the things. One of them is public order, safety, etc. But I actually think the general consensus now is that it's gone too far on the legislative level, and I completely agree with you about the sentencing. Sentencing being just horrific, and it's, you know, these are the harshest sentences in modern times when it comes to civil disobedience, and the fact that that has got so little public traction, I think, is really interesting.
Well, nobody knows. I mean, the public only engage on a sentence when there's a particular case and a particular sentence. You saw that on what was that lady's name who spoke after the killing and was really.
Police economy.
Yeah.
Did you not take up her case on it? No. Did you not take up her?
No. And people saw whatever it was, and it was more than a violent crime in some context, you know. So I mean, but people don't normally notice sentencing. That's one of the problems. But you're right. I mean, we agree on that.
Yeah, we agree on that. I think, you know, what's really disappointing, I think, is, public opinion, on this. And maybe that's, and I was going to ask you, David, about, what your sense of where Parliament was at on top of this, because these laws were passed. There's another kind of bill going through Parliament at the moment that's seeking to restrict protest even further in terms of cumulative disruption. All of this in a context where we don't know where we're going to land as a country in a few years' time and what kind of government will be in power. The idea that we would, restrict the right to protest further and restrict the right to kind of cumulative protest in this particular political context just feels quite odd. It feels really odd to me that that hasn't received more traction in Parliament.
Parliament is, I've been in Parliament for 38 years, nearly 39. And over that time, there has been a tendency for a variety of reasons for it to become more and more populist. It's partly, as it were, the sort of science and technology of politics. Post-Clinton, focus groups, and all that apparatus drove politics more towards seeking what the central view is. And today, if you listen to a parliamentary debate, 25 years ago, and you compare today looks like a series of sound bites or a series of tweets, 3-minute speeches where people just, and that doesn't simplify things enormously. And so the sort of argument, you couldn't have the debate we just had, really. And so that tends towards populism, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a generic move in all parties towards populism, and that doesn't favour an argument about liberty. Because generally speaking, populism tends to be authoritarian, and it tends to be, it tends to be it's not the language of hate, but the language of antagonism. I want this suppressed. I don't like this. I want it put right. I want the state to step in here, which, as you imagine, is not intrinsic in my politics.
I was trying to formulate a question about social media, actually, in this, because we've sort of danced around it, but it seems to me that when we're talking about the way discourse is hardening and people are kind of moving into silos, and the way politicians are shortening their speeches to get their social media clips, it seems to me that there must be an impact of how social media is changing the way we speak to each other, changing how we perceive our ability to express ourselves. Talk about the Lucy Conley case. Anika, what do you think? Do you see? Originally with social media, we thought that would be brilliant for freedom of expression, brilliant for democracy, and now you can increasingly see that actually there might be some evidence that it might actually cause some public debate and push people further apart. Do you think this is I guess my question is that impacting this? Is that impacting our right to protest?
Well, if I could rephrase it, the question is freedom a victim of algorithms? The answer is yes. I think that's the issue.
I think so, and I think that you can't talk about freedom of expression without talking about online freedom of expression, and yet they kind of felt quite separate, almost like in the policy space, and I think now people are kind of catching on to the fact that this is about expression more broadly, but we've been slow on the uptake on this, I think.
Well, of course, the battle we did have on this was on legal but harmful, where I was an arguer for taking that out of the original bill. Accepted it, but others may disagree with that. But I just thought that was a terribly, potentially corrosive effect on freedom of speech.
Can I see a show of hands for who has questions they want to ask the panel? Because there are quite a few. Yes, I will. I did have one more. I wanted to put you about ECHR, but maybe someone in the audience will do that for me. So sorry, show me your hands again. Do we have our roving mic? Fantastic. Okay, let's start at the back. Maybe we'll try and take two at once. So these two gentlemen there. So if you ask your question and then hand your microphone down. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a very principled discussion, but I wonder if I could drag you into practicalities. Does there come a point where the number of people being arrested, or for that matter, the number of people willing to be arrested, affects the credibility of a protest law?
Thank you. And the other gentleman there.
Hello, Dan Dolan, Deputy CEO of Reprieve. My question is how optimistic you are for the rest of this Parliament about progress and where that could come from if there was an authoritarian trend in this government and in the discourse. Like, where is the pushback? How do you strengthen protest rights in that political climate?
Thank you. Keith, do you want to go first?
I'm not sure how much political space there is around the rights of protest in this Parliament. No, I think I think that space is minimal. But also, what I'll acknowledge is that the world is very turbulent. Things change all the time, and that might change. But it doesn't feel like the government, is creating that space. To your point, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but you might be referring to arrests under the Terrorism Act, where I think, which is obviously different to public order arrests, but I think that clearly that has been an argument that's been made in the press quite widely, that the number of arrests for offences supporting a prescribed organisation might potentially undermine the prescription of that organisation.
Let me pick that one up first. I mean, we were talking about Palestinian proscription. I was worried about that in the first instance because it seemed to me that there was an interface between support, external legal support for the organisation, well, external support for the organisation. The organisation itself does appear to have done some pretty horrible things, but it's in court now, so I can't really talk about it. So it's not simply a quantitative question, really, but generally speaking, if a large number of people are willing to be arrested for something, it puts the state's position into some question, and it does actually have the impact of elevating the argument up to the front. What the outcome is, I say, depends on the quality of argument they're putting, whether they're in the right or wrong, whether they're justifying violence or whatever oppression. And so, yeah, it's not a simple quantitative question. In terms of progress, Dan, I don't really know, but my modus operandi for the last 25 years tends to start with an issue which is unpopular and tries to make it popular. And the first step in that is to try and get the debate out of the echo chambers, out of the 120-word limit or whatever it is, outside the algorithm. And I think you'd have to sort of pick an issue for me, but I think there is some scope of doing that. So, for example, Dan Reprieve have been heavily involved in the Shamima Begum story, right? And that's a circumstance where populist weight is 80-20 against us at least, right? Not working. The populist weight is against us. The government's line is against us. The opposition official line is against us. It's a perfect battle. It's where ID cards were once. But circumstance may go the other way, right? So, we were talking before about the fact the Americans are intervening in Syria to try and release some of these young women and so on. So, that's quite a good example. It may well be in a year's time I can win that argument in Parliament. Today I can't, right? And the same applies across many, many other circumstances. And you have to I'm afraid you have to trust people like me, and there are plenty others like me, who say, oh, the circumstances here, we can now put this right. Yeah? So it's a rather woolly answer, but I'm afraid that's the reality.
Thank you. Hands up, please. Okay, we'll go to this lady down here, and then we'll pass that to the gentleman behind her, if that's all right. Thank you.
Hi.
You got my mic.
You're quite close. I just wondered how much you think the media is culpable in all this, because what I've just heard you say, you talked about the farmers, and apparently they have support. You put a march, a climate march, for example, which I think you're implying maybe doesn't have as much support. Nothing gets in the media, and so then, there is then to get noticed, there becomes more extreme tactics. I would say the media is massively helpful in that, because there is definitely right-wing support for the farmers and a very heavy right-wing press. So I'd really like to get your views on that.
Yeah, I don't really blame the media for it. I mean, cast my mind back. So it's a very, very long historic analogy or whatever. The CND marches didn't get good coverage. Well, they got coverage, but it wasn't very. It was pretty hostile coverage back in the day, and they didn't find it necessary to disrupt things and so on. But I think there's sort of an absolute in this. Whenever you're talking about freedoms, and this is true right across the board, whether it's free speech or other free actions, you've always got to balance off how much of somebody else's freedom are you cutting into, and that's for me. That's why that test lies where it does. And the truth is, if you get enough people on march, it gets covered, even if the media absolutely bloody hates it. Look at the Tommy Robinson stuff. Detestable people, but nevertheless, they got coverage.
I think there's been huge media hostility. And I also think it's more mixed. What do I think? I think you need to make your case, and you have to bring people with you, and you have to bring a broad coalition of people with you. And I think at one point with climate, it was there, but there was so much hostility, and perhaps there wasn't, and I think there will be others in the audience who might disagree quite strongly with me about this, but it does feel like a very, very hostile environment at multiple levels, at the legislative level, at the media level, etc., policy level, but also one which didn't quite at that point, and it will likely happen again, didn't quite kind of like capture enough people perhaps. So I think I'm always a little bit hesitant about blaming journalists for things, because I think you can like understand, you can look at like the political context of where media is and who owns what, but I don't think journalists are to blame for the stories they cover. So I think I'm just trying to kind of bring out some of that, but certainly huge amounts of media hostility.
Can I make another counterpoint? Look, the central core, not of party politics, but of campaigning politics, is how you deal with an unpopular cause. And go completely off subject for a second. How many of you have heard of the Lucy Letby case? Yeah? The day I started with that campaign, just about everybody in the country hated her. The Daily Mail carried front page news, the monster of the monster nurse and so on. Most other newspapers did the same. And the most difficult exercise in that campaign was the first 3 months. And I think, and we can make the argument, I was saying the same about ID cards, the same about Shemai Begum. There are just lots of unpopular causes, and you just have to be willing to fight the cause without breaking the law. It's a hard argument, but it's one you have to address.
I don't think climate is unpopular.
No, I don't. But the truth is,
You can't compare climate with Lucy Letby.
I was not comparing. What I'm saying is, if you're having trouble getting through a barrier, media barrier, or whatever, you just have to face up to it time and time again. I don't know what the popularity or otherwise of the Shemai Begum case is. What I do know is what the tabloid journals will do with it, which is entirely hostile. And you have to be able to get through that. And sometimes that takes a little bit of nerve and a lot of work, but that's democracy.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Tom Tyler, University of Hull.
My local.
Yes, exactly. Well, your constituent for 15 years now.
You're still alive, you survived.
Yes, I've moved into the others constituencies now. No reflection. I suppose I think it's interesting that you started your history with Blair. Blair was bad on this. The Tories before and after have been just as bad, if not. And I think it's important to notice that when we look at Section 28, we look at ANC, that was, so I think all governments have been bad on this. And I've got two questions really. One is your position, David, that protest is only legitimate if people can ignore it? That seemed to be where you were going at one point. You were saying, that, well, it's okay they can stop the roads, but as long as you get round it. That seemed to be the implication of what you were saying. And I may be wrong on that. And then the other question was about social context, and you said that this was a crucial moment. And this brings us to the notions of the importance of social media, but also about reporting, who controls the media and so on, about the way in which images can be controlled. I was here in 1988 when there was the Rushdie demonstration at the end of Westminster Bridge, and we saw it. Friends saw this happening, and there was a group of people, Muslim men, not burning effigies, but we saw that in real time. We got home literally that evening and saw it being broadcast on the television, and the cropping of the image, the way in which it was cut, was clearly a manipulation of that event.
Clearly?
A manipulation of that event. And that's hardly news that everyone looks for the story in the media. But I think then with social media, the context has become even less controllable, and it can be changed. So I wonder then, you say we have to look at the context. I wonder how possible that is anymore.
Yeah, especially when we can't trust the evidence, or it feels really, really difficult to trust the evidence. If we look at what happened in Minnesota, and the fact that there's video footage, that video footage in itself is being questioned and has been manipulated, just kind of shows you the complexity, of some of this. So I agree with that.
Yeah, and two things. Firstly, I think I started by saying all states are authoritarian. Or have a principled a direction towards authority. That's every state since we've had democracy, and probably, well, certainly before. So I take that point. In terms of, you can't, any attempt to control the media ends up with a bias of a different sort. And I'm coming to the view, and it's a view I'm sort of arriving at over time, is that our protection against that is diversity of media rather than trying to get some sort of agreement with the middle ground. That agreement with the middle ground has disappeared in my political lifetime. So it's diversity of media, and then of course what happens is, one of them goes viral, one of them gets purchased, and that's what you have to do. That's what you have to rely on.
David, does that mean you no longer support the BBC?
No, I think, but I don't think the BBC is unbiased. Do you remember the Hutton inquiry? Which I attended, and then the head of the BBC got dismissed. The BBC became a tame servant of the government for the next couple of years. So no, I don't think the BBC is unbiased. I wouldn't organise BBC the way it is now. I'd actually separately fund Radio 4, for example.
Well, only Radio 4.
No. Well, don't tell me like instinctively. No, I mean I would separately, it's a different matter, and I would actually create a trust for Radio 4 so nobody could get it. But there you go. That's another matter. But I think diverse, and frankly, if the BBC loses audiences at the current rate, my view's going to be irrelevant in 10 years' time. Diversity is going to be more important.
But listen, I think that was a really important question about inconvenience, because you draw the line between kind of lawful protest and unlawful.
Yeah, that's
No,
right.
you need to answer it because this is the bit where we disagree. The inconvenience bits, and you're saying basically if it inconveniences people, that's not on. But you know the argument. Protests are always
we do differ, but my argument wasn't quite that. My argument was all protests cause inconvenience. The question is that what it's designed to do? Am I gluing myself to a train or to stop every commuter get home? Am I blocking this road? And I gave the example, actually, the transport thing. Am I blocking this road? My way of making a point, and thereby robbing everybody wants to go home, or the ambulance, or whatever it is, of the freedom to do their job or to live their lives. I think when you're talking about freedom, you have to look at when you increase one freedom, is it diminishing somebody else's? And what's the optimum point? What's the point of division? That actually is what these acts of parliament try to do, completely incompetently, in my view. Yeah, but that's what they were trying to do.
But what about, okay, so that's, I mean, I don't agree with you about that, but that's fine. But what about the, what about the animal testing thing? So this idea that, you know, if it's national infrastructure, you know, there are all these rules, you know, the public order legislation applies to that. And so now we're going to call animal testing sites national infrastructure, and therefore you can't protest outside of them.
Yeah, well, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with, some of these are banning even of individuals from doing things. I'm really antagonistic to that. So no.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, possibly two. So that lady back there, and then who else? And then we'll squeeze in this one from down here. If you could just keep it brief, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. I've been involved in lots of protests, some creative, some disruptive. I was very involved in organising youth strikes, which I think in some ways on paper...
Organising?
The youth strikes, where all those young people went into the streets for climate change in the year that a Conservative government passed the 2015 net zero legislation, which was very progressive, as a result of mass protests by Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes. I think we're in danger a little bit, David, I'd be interested in your opinion, and kind of this idea of a good protester, or a good protest, or this idea of kind of, you know, I think one of the benefits of the youth strikes was that they were kind of out of control, insofar as it was a mass movement of young people, mostly under the age of 15, taking to the streets as a show of emotion and strength and principle. And a lot of it, and I really was very much in the centre of that, was very out of control and could have gone in one direction or another. I mean, I remember running down the street with thousands of teenagers. They climbed that monument. I thought someone was going to die. I was genuinely very terrified. It wasn't in control, but it was still perceived as good because of the image of a young person talking about climate change. It was very moving, emotive. It just ticked all the boxes. I think there's a bit of a danger with some of this that we can kind of sanitize protest and creative intervention in a way that doesn't necessarily prove to be effective in the history of social change. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Can I start off by saying I recoil against the idea of a good or bad protest, right? That's why I hate the argument of, you know, this is an extremist. That's a value judgment on the purpose of the protest. That's none of my business. That's nobody's business except protesters at one level. And no, they're not sanitized. I mean, my question would be, who else was put at risk other than the individual? I've just been watching somebody climb a 100-foot building, a 100-story building, and enjoying it. But who else is put at risk by that? If nobody, the answer is nobody, then so what? And I don't care about whether it's exciting or not. I just care who else's freedom's infringed by. And if the answer is nobody, get on with it.
Thank you. Gentleman down here. Thank you.
Fantastic conversation. Values and speed, really, I suppose, where I wanted to talk about. The UK will lead a global governance body later this year, and one of its priorities is shrinking the space for civil society. And I sometimes wonder whether our values internationally are different to what we apply domestically, whether you see that kind of juxtaposition. And secondly, the speed. We know that democratic emotion is structural. It's small steps, bit by bit by bit. But our politicians and policymakers are working in smaller cycles. They're working in media cycles, they're working in polling, political cycles, whereas we can see this gradual erosion over years. How do we square that? What can we do?
Yeah, it sounds like the political answer to entropy. But you can't stop it, really. I mean,
do they care that the politicians see that gradual erosion? Or
do they see it?
Yeah, or are they just concerned about the poll?
All right, erosion of exactly what you're talking about.
Democracy.
Democracy. Oh, well, I mean, I rail against that almost weekly, as you would know if you read my publications. But and one of the arguments I'm having actually within my own party is about the extent to which we control our state, the extent to which Parliament controls the state. I was talking to David earlier about the fact that over the course of my lifetime in politics, there has been look okay at first stage. You know, I don't know, family-friendly House and House of Commons means we can no longer filibuster the government. So it's a power gone. It may not sound very important until you get a policy you really hate, and we can do nothing about it. And lots and lots and lots of other mechanistic things, as well as social media, and we're not going to stop social media. So all of these things are creating a different sort of state, and it's sort of a bit like what I was saying earlier to Dan. We have to find ways of making democracy work within it. I don't have all the answers for you, I'm not clever enough. Others may, but between us, that's what we have to do.
I'm going to share some insights from her sister organisations around the world, and where some of this is more advanced. And what has really kind of like stayed with me is that change is slow, 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 quick, quick, quick. And I think we might be at an inflection point. And by the time it gets quick and noticeable, it's really, really difficult to switch things around. And that's one of them. And the other is that shutting down protest or curtailing it is a precondition for authoritarianism. And it doesn't mean that the government that's putting that legislation in place now is authoritarian, but it's enabling, a future government of that kind of stripe to kind of do that. And that is why this is such a critical conversation. If we're going to be thinking about how to strengthen democracy, we have to uphold the rights of protest.
Yeah. And can I make one optimistic point at the end?
Please do. Yes.
And it's this. I mean, the last thing we did together, your organisation and I did together, was the Data Retention Investigative Powers Act, which we stopped and forced to be changed in court. In court. Oh yeah, no, I mean in actual action. We stopped. It went all the way to the ECHR, and we beat the government at every turn, and they had to rewrite the act. Right. The reason I'm raising that is because it's one of the reasons I'm having arguments inside my own party about the importance of courts. Lots and lots of ex-ministers hate the fact that they've been fettered by this court or that court. Some of the best work on the various acts we're talking about and the interpretation of them by the police has been done by the courts, right? So there is a very, very important dimension here in the debate that comes up, that when Parliament gets it wrong, or when the institutions of the state gets it wrong, at the moment, because of the weakness of Parliament, the last recourse is the court. And actually, I mean, I've got lots and lots of criticism of the British judicial system, but in this respect, it actually does a good job.
Thank you, Gary. Do you have anything you want to add as a sort of positive takeaway or a solution we can look to while we wrap up?
I mean, I think this is an inflection point in history, just huge turbulence. And with that opportunity, and, if we are thinking that some of the kind of the foundations of our democracy are at risk, and I think they might be, that it's also an opportunity for us to think, well, what kind of institutions do we want? Do we deserve? Can we reimagine? So I think there is an invitation there for us to be thinking longer term, and I think that's the thing, that we need to hold on to.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Please join me in thanking the panel.